Thanks, Ryan. Great to see so many familiar faces again. It's been a bit. Like Ryan said, he asked me just to chat a little bit about some disease issues. So I'm going to start with sort of some general comments around control or management options that might apply to most things that you're dealing with from a disease perspective. And then end with that kind of a summary too. But then in the middle, we'll talk specifically about certain diseases. And please feel free to shout out or make comments, negative or positive. If they're negative, just don't make them personal. First time I've been in this venue, is it ever cool? We were talking earlier, and I guess it was a movie theater, like in the past.
Yeah.
I don't know if it's still used for that at all. No. I don't know if what I have is as exciting as a movie, but and I'm not Harrison Ford, but anyway, we'll do our best. Do you want to do the lights again, Ryan? I think it was nice to see the.
As long as everybody doesn't go to sleep.
Yeah, well, depends how many Timbits you had out there. So yeah, we'll just chat a little bit about some seed disease issues. And so these are some of the sort of general comments I wanted to chat around. And in a way, it's an advantage to be third in this sort of series that we've been doing, because we've already had some discussions around some of these things, and certain things that have come up that probably are some of the things that you'd be interested in hearing about as well. So like Newton was saying too, I mean, using high quality seed is huge. So how do you know you have that? Well, you know, how the seed was produced, what were the disease issues in the field, what was harvest condition like, storage conditions for the seed, and you know, all of those things that go into making quality seed. The more you know about those, the more information that you'd have to work with to decide on management options for your seed. Sometimes maybe that information is easier to get than others. Maybe for local seed, you probably have a pretty good idea of some of that. Maybe for seed that's coming off island, it might be more difficult to get some of that information, but as much of that as you can get certainly is helpful. We talked already with Newton's talk a little bit about whole seed tubers versus cut tubers. As you know, there's some production areas in the world where whole seed is the standard. And if you think about it from a disease point of view, if you cut a tuber, like Newton was saying, it's a wound, right? And pathogens love to have a wound to get into a tuber to cause disease. So because we're still based around cutting in North America for the most part, you know, we do have to deal with that wound and from a disease perspective. But I think in Ryan's talk, after mine, he'll talk a little bit maybe about a bit of a hybrid approach between cutting and whole seed that might be helpful. And I won't steal his thunder, so I'll let him talk a little bit more about that. But certainly that's an issue that we have to deal with. And so since we do have a wound, you know, we tend to want to let that heal first. So that's where that whole decision around cut and store versus cut and plant comes into play. And Newton talked a little bit about some advantages for some varieties of cutting and storing. When you think about it, and you have a wound, you know, you want that wound to heal so the pathogen doesn't get in there and cause issues, whatever that pathogen is. If you cut and store, as long as you have those good conditions for storage, so the pal's not too high, you have good ventilation, it's drying, the temperature is right, that's probably a better scenario, because when you're cutting and planting with fresh cut, you often don't know what the weather's going to be. So if you run into an issue or a time where it's going to be cool, wet, and the seed is sitting in there for too long, then you can run into troubles with disease that way. So maybe there's a little more controllable if you have store and cut, as long as you have the facilities to do that, versus fresh cut. But really, I know the weather's unpredictable, but if you do get a sense in the next few days of a trend, if you can trust Environment Canada that much, and you see that the conditions might be improving, it might be beneficial to wait a little bit before you plant to get those better conditions. I was saying in the other sessions, there isn't really a trophy for being the first guy to plant. The trophy comes at the end of the race, not the beginning when you're lining up. So it could be beneficial, to wait a bit if that's logistically possible for you to get those better growing conditions, because it's often a race between the pathogen and emerging. So, the seed tuber is a resource of food for the sprout and the growth of the plant. You don't want that to be decayed by pathogens, so it's a race between that process of decay versus the emergence. So the longer that seed sits in poor conditions and emergence is delayed, the more time the pathogens have to break it down. So you want to get as quick emergence as possible to avoid that situation. Another factor, you can remove diseased tubers before you cut as much as possible if you're able to cull some of those out. The stuff that you see, you don't see everything obviously, but things like Fusarum dry rot are usually pretty obvious when they're bad, and if you can remove some of those, because you're cutting tubers that are diseased, and those spores will then spread to the healthy cut seed pieces, causing disease on those. So if you can reduce that as much as possible, that's helpful. And another way that helps you reduce that spread is by cleaning and disinfecting the cutters and the equipment. Not sure if Newton showed us one of his slides, but between seed lots sort of is a minimum. More often is better. And Ryan again is going to show you some images of a system where the disinfection is happening more frequently, and it's quite effective system. So again, I won't steal his thunder there. The other thing I wanted to mention about cutting is the sharpness is very important of the cutters. And the reason is that if you think about cutting a piece, if it's sharp, you get a nice clean surface, and that surface will heal and dry faster. And if it's more of a crushed thing or a jagged cut, if it's not sharp, the crushing will sometimes release more moisture, and that will create a little bit more of a pathogen concern. But also, when you think about those surfaces, they won't be nice and clean. They'll be more jaggedy, and there'll be little crevices, and those are where water collects, and the pathogens will then multiply in those areas. So a clean cut's really important for reducing disease on those cut surfaces. Of course, the seed storage conditions are really important. You don't want condensation building up. Any free moisture is bad. When you think about microorganisms, it's usually two things: moisture and temperature. So the warmer, the wetter, the more they like to grow and attack. And we've already talked about favorable conditions at planting. If you can try to wait if possible, that's helpful. And when you're handling the seed, even though of course you're making a cut, but if it's then healed nicely, you want to make sure that you're not injuring it more during the transportation and handling process. And we'll talk a little bit more about seed treatments. The main comment here right now is our treatments really that we have are meant to control some fungal diseases, but nothing else, like bacteria or viruses. They don't address any of those. And so if you're adding a treatment, you're adding moisture too. So in some cases, it can actually hurt you if there's too much moisture on there and the bacteria start to grow in there, because the chemical doesn't act against bacteria. You're creating perhaps a bad situation there. And because of that, I like to show this slide. And actually Newton had this in his talk too, but he skipped past it because after a few days we've known what slides each other has. So this is actually a post-harvest spray, but it's the same for application, at planting too. And it's a picture that I got from Jeff Miller, who used to be at the University of Idaho. Now he runs a private company called Miller Research. You probably either heard Jeff or seen him before at various meetings in North America. And it's a nice image showing, the optimal situation for applying a spray to a tuber versus situations where there's too much moisture. And you can see here how you have a sheen there. That's the free moisture that's on the surface that will encourage pathogens to grow. Versus what you're looking for is more of just a dampness, kind of. You still want good coverage, because coverage is important for you know, disease control. But you don't want to put too much water. Sometimes more water helps you get the coverage, but if you get too much, then you don't want that free moisture on there. And actually the dye, and you know, a lot of people are using Titan Amesto or Amesto Silver products. You know, that helps you get an idea of what your coverage is like too, and perhaps also the level of moisture that you have. So just to talk a little bit about some diseases that we tend to think about in terms of seed and at planting. A lot of the bacteria, I don't work on these directly. Probably the local expert will be Sean Lee at CFIA. But we usually deal with either like soft rot types. Oops, excuse me. I have to hit the right button here, would be good. That wasn't the right one. Let's go back, there we go. So we're usually dealing with the soft rot bacteria like Pectobacterium keratoverum, or the ones that cause blackleg, another species of Pectobacterium. You might have heard of this Dickia. It's one that's becoming more common in some states. It's a concern because it's really aggressive and it'll actually melt down plants a lot quicker than some of the typical Pectobacteriums that we normally deal with. So my colleague Larry Kachuk in Alberta has recently finished a survey of Alberta seed, because blackleg's been a problem in Alberta for many years in their production areas, and we're seeing it a little bit more here, especially in those drier, hotter summers that Newton talked about that we've been getting in the last few years, which, you know, blackleg tends to express itself more in those summers. But Larry's just done a survey and found that 80% of their blackleg was caused by Pectobacterium atrosepticum, and the other 20% was the keratoverum. So they didn't find any Dickia, which is good news. And you know, we're going to keep a handle on that, because obviously it's one that we don't want to see starting to creep into the production system. So just to comment on some of those bacterial diseases which have become a little more common recently. Pink rot is something you might not think about as a seed issue, but you know, a lot of the, especially during wet falls, a lot of the infection happens at harvest time, going into storage, and a lot of that seed will melt. But you can get infections that aren't visible and stay in the tuber and then cause an infected seed piece. And a little bit different than late blight, when it germinates then as a seed, those spores will then be around the soil to infect the daughter tubers. Late blight, you can actually get an infected plant right from the infected seed. So it's a little bit different in that way. But you know, we've done a lot of surveys over the last number of years with our pink rot populations here in the island and across Canada. And we're about 50% or so of resistance to Ridamil. So Ridamil is still really not a great option for pink rot. But luckily we do have some good options now that are available. And some of the work we've done here to get this product registered, which is experimental here, was actually now Arondis Gold. It's quite effective. It's an in-furrow that you can use for managing pink rot. And then of course the foliar phosphites, like your Fostrols, your Confines, that sort of thing, are really effective against pink rot. But there's been a bit of caution around using those on seed crops, just because we have seen a bit of emergence issues. Those products move systemically right down the tuber, fantastic for controlling tuber rot, but the odd time we've seen a bit of an emergence thing with those. It's something we need to find out more about, because we're not sure what concentration or what varieties are more affected. We've certainly seen varieties like Dakota, that Newton was talking about, be very sensitive to foliar phosphites and cause burning in the leaves compared to other varieties. So we certainly have noticed that. So there are variety differences in how you use that product. So that's something definitely to be aware of. I did mention late blight. You know, I was talking yesterday that, wow, I mean, we haven't seen late blight now in 5 or 6 years on the island. Like, that's unbelievable. When I first started working on it, it was an annual thing. I mean, there wasn't a year that you wouldn't see late blight. So I think that's another, you know, indication maybe of climate change, that, my goodness, things must be getting a little warmer and drier if we don't have late blight. In fact, more people talk about early blight now, which we used to say, oh, there's a Western Canadian disease, early blight, right? But now it's kind of on our radar more. So definitely things are changing. But certainly you can get infected seed with blight, and you know, usually knowing if there was blight in the field where your seed comes from would be pretty important in that situation. And you can get sporulating from an infected seed piece during cutting, and then that's spreading to the other seed pieces during the cutting process. But we do have some new seed treatments that to help manage that. Things based on Redis are pretty good at preventing the spread of spores of late blight during the cutting process. So that's something to note. As well, you know, we talked a little about the tomato angle in recent years. A lot of the blights come in on tomato transplants, and that's pretty much been controlled here now. We've had really good uptake from some of the local suppliers of tomato transplants, like your Vessies and Cool Breeze, for example, and that kind of thing. A lot of late blight resistant tomato varieties available for home grow owners now, and there's been pretty good uptake on that, so there's less of a risk to the production areas. And that's been kind of a nice community story. Silver scurf and black dot are two other diseases. For the most part, when I've looked at tubers here in DEI, silver scurf has been by far #1. We see black dot, you know, on the stems late in the season, but it's not as common to see on the tubers here. And Ryan shared some information yesterday that Mar'23 shared with him around our inoculum levels for black dot were much lower here than they were in the west. So that kind of confirms what we've been seeing. But yeah, silver scurf seems to be certainly pretty prevalent, and it can be seed-borne. And you know, a lot of the spread happens in storage in the ventilation system when spores spread around, but if you get infected seed and you plant it, you can then get spores around those daughter tubers. So, you know, that's certainly a concern. And you can tell them apart pretty easily in the lab under the scope. The silver scurf kind of has this Christmas tree-like spore, and black dot produces these little spikes in their spore structure. So they're not hard to tell apart in the lab. But typically a lot of the same types of things apply to managing silver scurf on the seed. We do have some fungicides that are effective, and we also have this issue that's come up with a lot of our disease problems that are caused by fungi. That's chemical resistance. So we found a lot of resistance to Senator and Maxim, fluoxanil and thiophanate methyl, in the silver scurf pathogen. But so far the new products that we tend to use, the Cruiser Max, Potato Extreme, or the Amesa Silver, they're still effective. We haven't seen any resistance yet to those. So that's good news. And I guess we talked about this product here yesterday. It's what, the last year maybe, is it, for Senator Lorraine? Is that correct? Or it's moving out of the system now?
Yeah, I can't remember the dates for last days by the farmer.
Yeah. And then the other product that we used to use a lot, Mancozeb, of course, on seed, which mitigated a lot of our resistance issues, is also phased out. So we're losing a lot of those old powders. We're left with some of these liquids, which right now are working. But my worry is now if we're only dealing with, you know, a couple of options, and you know, yesterday most of the guys are pretty much going with Titan Amesto. Would that be true here too? Is that your #1? Anyone have a comment on that, or am I hearing yeses or nos? Yes. Yes. So if we're left with only one option, my concern is that, you know, we're relying on one chemistry, and the resistance risk is going to be pretty high too. So we're going to keep an eye on that. You know, the next couple of years, hopefully, we won't see some resistance starting to develop again.
There are two options. It's just that there's one that's more popular, I think.
There are two options. You mean with these two?
Yeah.
Right.
Cruiser Max is available, and they now have Vibrance, which is for Rhizotonia.
Right.
But you see more red potatoes on the truck sitting in the field than anything.
True. But even though these are two products, you notice that these are both triazoles. So the resistance, there's probably good cross resistance there. So, you know what I mean? Like, where resistance risk is still high. Common scab, another seed-borne issue, also soil-borne. You can find scab in soils that have never seen potatoes, like in a forest soil, for example. But it can be found on the seed, and you know, when we have a disease nursery in Harrington where we tend to do our scab trials and compare varieties for scab resistance, that sort of thing, the way we build up the inoculum there is by putting scabby tubers in there every fall and working them in. So you can certainly get a lot of scab from the seed piece, you know, causing a problem for the developing tubers too. But you know, when we look at scab, I call it one of the most frustrating diseases. Probably a lot of people think of it that way. It's really difficult to manage. We don't have many tools to, at least single tools to manage this issue. And so we've been trying to look at different ways to maybe combine different strategies to improve your odds. I find this is to be one of the more sort of gambling type scenarios where to manage it, you kind of have to improve your odds at different things and then hope that that is giving you some success. And we'll talk a little bit about a few things that might help. We've done a bunch of trials with the East Prince Environmental Association group, some of the growers there, as well as the Living Labs sort of funding that we've had for the last 4 years. And Yifeng Zhang's actually been looking at supplemental irrigation impacts. And he gives me the tubers from some of these trials, and we have a look at them for disease. And what we've found over the last 4 years in 13 fields that we've been looking at with these types of trials, you know, 62% of the fields, some form of irrigation reduced the common scab incidence. We didn't see an effect in one field, and then in 4 fields it was kind of variable. And it's not surprising that there would be some variability because, as you can imagine, each year is going to be different. In some years, the you know, like the last couple that have had more moisture, you know, the difference between the irrigated stuff and the non are not that big. It's fairly similar. Whereas in those dry years before, there'd be quite a difference between the stuff that got the supplemental irrigation. But what we're finding is that, yeah, you know, the timing of water is really the key thing here. Scab usually affects right when those tubers are starting to form. And if you can have adequate moisture during that time period when the tubers are forming, that's the most important. So timing is huge. Now varieties differ in that, right? Some of them not only start that process at different times, but some of them sort of set most of their tubers in a shorter window, and some take a longer time to set their tubers. So you might need water over a longer stretch for some varieties than others to cover that window off. But you know, that does give you, in a lot of cases, a bit of a positive in terms of managing scab if you can have adequate moisture there. So I mentioned a lot of variety influences, soil chemistry. In PEI, we tend to have an association with pH and scab, so that the higher pH tends to have a little more scab. But as we discussed yesterday, it's not so much the number that's important, it's the change. So if your soil, you know, is around a 5.8 and then you're doing something, either adding a soil amendment or something that shifts it up a little bit, that's when you kind of tend to see the scab. It's not so much what the number is, it's the change from what you started with that usually causes a spike. And there's a lot we need to learn about the different strains and species of Streptomyces that we deal with here. And Claudia Goyer, who's my colleague in Fredericton, she's got a lot of samples from PEI in Brunswick and other places in Canada, and we're starting to try to get a better handle on how many different strains we have here on the island. So stay tuned for a little more information on that. But that might be one of the reasons that this thing is so hard to control, is because we're dealing with so many different strains. We also looked at tillage. It's something we looked at over the years, but Judith's looked at that as part of the Living Labs with the growers in the East Prince group. And essentially, in the 10 fields we've looked at over the past 3 years, in 60% or 6 of the fields, we didn't see an impact of tillage at all on scab. In one field, scab increased which is unusual under the plowing regimen versus the res till. And then in 3 fields, scab increased under res till. And that's sometimes something we see sometimes, and it tends to be something that we see when a cereal crop or there's straw residue in the res till situation. If there's crops like some of the disease suppressive crops like mustard and so on, that usually is more neutral or even a positive effect on controlling scab. So it tends to be when that grass or cereal crop is in the mix, usually right before potatoes and some heavy straw there, that has been sometimes a situation where we've seen scab tick up a bit. But there's a lot of factors here, again, that impact that, the water, again, the variety and so on. So, and we've been talking, last day, res till has so many positive benefits for moisture retention and soil health and so on. We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, I think was the expression. So it's just probably a matter of managing the scab scenario around that to mitigate the scab risk there. I think Ryan, we had some ideas yesterday. Ryan, what were they like? If you're liming, say, you're putting it on
After potatoes instead of before.
right.
Like
That's one strategy. And there was some other comments you had.
And just avoiding like a lot of plow down of really high carbon material shortly before potatoes, because that seems to be generally where I hear the most issue with scab. It's when it's heavy hay crop that's full, like that's heavy residue with a lot of carbon ahead of potatoes, or like, as you say, leaving the straw on, not taking the straw off, that sort of stuff.
Right. So just in summary, like if you want to increase your odds, you try to do a combination of things for scab. So, non-scabby seed is your seed source, is one important factor. There's more variety resistance. That's probably the best way to control scab. If you have that option, some of the growers have told me that a project they'd like me to do next is to tell them which fields they have which have more scab inoculum in the soil compared to others, so that if they know the fields that are particularly at risk, they could maybe use a more resistant variety in that field compared to some of the others. Because obviously we're growing certain varieties based on other considerations, not based on scab resistance necessarily. So if you do have a choice of a variety that's resistant to scab, maybe you can put it in that most at-risk field. So we're going to hopefully do a little more work on that, because there are some molecular tests now that we can use to figure out what's in the soil that way. And soil moisture, seems to be still, if you can maintain that adequate soil moisture, if you have the opportunity of supplementing irrigation, then that can be useful. And, managing that soil pH with some of the things Ryan just mentioned, and then the whole thing about residues too. So really, it's kind of the thing like, if you do all these things, you're probably improving your odds of reducing your scab risk. Is it perfect? No. Can you still get scab? Yes, unfortunately, but it's all a matter of, like I said, playing the odds to improve your chances. The other factor here, and Ryan's just brought us samples from 15 different locations in PEI, because this last year there was maybe a little more scab than people expected. And one question is, well, are we starting to see powdery scab? It's a disease that's in Western Canada, Alberta, and New Brunswick. We've seen it there. We tend not to think about it here, but are we going to start to see it? So we're having a look at that. It looks a lot like common scab, but usually it's a little more circular, and then the pustules, they kind of look like they're ruptured. You can see the little flaps of skin around them. And inside those pustules are black spores, and they're called resting spores. They look like this. Not hard to pick up under the microscope, but it's a concern because those spores can survive in the soil. So if we're planting seed that has powdery scab, well, it could then go into the soil and survive in the soil, and that would make it more difficult to manage that disease. So that's something that we're going to be looking at. In a couple of weeks, we should have an answer, at least for those 15 samples, if we do see any powdery scab. Finally, a couple of comments on Fusarium and then Rhizoc. Fusarium you've all seen, causing dry rot. Lots of different varieties affected. There is some differences in susceptibility, but since it enters in a wound for the most part, it bypasses most varieties' resistance mechanisms, so a lot of susceptibility to Fusarium out there. Here's a seed lot that was cut and treated, and then you can see how the Fusarium is just moving through it. And this is one example of a case where we had fungicide resistance of that Fusarium to that treatment. And obviously, you know, resulting in misses in more severe cases. We can pull off up to 30 different species of Fusarium from a tuber, but usually it's these three that we worry about the most: Sambucinum, Ceruleum, and Avinencium. And all three of them are here at different times. Usually, as I mentioned, we had some resistance issues show up in around 2005, 2007 to Maxim or fludeoxanil, and also to, again, Senator and thiophanate methyl. But anything that had mancozeb or anything like the Cruiser Max or Titanomesto were quite effective and still are against these Fusarium strains. So that's good news too. And this is just a review of some of the issues or some of the management strategies for Fusarium, which are similar to what we've already talked about, so I don't need to go through those again. Yeah. I'll finish up with just a couple of comments on Rhizoc. Definitely can be seed-borne, black scurf phase. When those tubers sit in the soil a long time at the end of the season, after top kill, the longer they're in the soil, the more black scurf you can usually get, because it's the survival form of the fungus, so it likes to make that black scurf on the tubers to survive the winter. And then, of course, you're planting tubers that have black scurf as seed, while you can get this kind of cankering on the stolons and the lower stems, and even like nipping off of emerging sprouts, so that the plant has to bypass and make a new sprout. That takes a lot of energy, so you're reducing your emergence and your vigor of the plant. So, you know, definitely a problem. And we tend to find in our trials that if you've got 1% to 2% of black scurf on the seed, not too bad, you won't really see much of an impact, but once you get up to 4 or 5%, there's usually a significant impact in getting disease and yield reduction.
There's a little button right there. Okay.
This disease is soil-borne too, so to manage it, you have to not only manage the seed inoculum, but also what's in the soil. Different ways to do that. Rotations can help. The mustards are great against Rhizoc. Like with the wireworm work Christine's done, well, awesome against Rhizoc too, that mustard crop. And Quadris is still pretty effective in furrow against Rhizoc, so there is some tools for the soil, as well as the seed. The sprays you're using for Fusarium are also very effective against Rhizoc so far. We haven't seen any resistance in this particular pathogen. So as I mentioned, you really have to control both the seed and the soil inoculum for this disease. So just in summary then, to wrap up, your seed source and quality is really important. You want to start off with something good to get a good crop. Culling out obvious disease before your cut. We talked a bit about the whole cut versus whole seed thing. Seed treatments are useful in some cases, especially against certain fungi, but it doesn't help you for some other diseases. There are some fungicide resistance issues, but luckily we have some products now that for now are working. We talked a bit about the whole cut and store versus cut and plant, disinfection, making sure you're managing your moisture so that you're not adding free moisture for pathogens to grow, and then trying to plant in those conditions to give you the best emergence possible. So I guess in a nutshell, those are some of the key things to think about when you're trying to manage disease at this time of the year when you're ready to plant. I think that's all I've got for now. Does anyone have any comments or questions?